Professor Nicholas Mirzoeff, who's also going to be looking at the intersection of modernity and climate change. But his main theme is the shift from the printed word to the visual image. And it's interesting. I mean, that's such a huge change, and it's hard sometimes for someone like me to get. I was reared, by the nuns, and we had ruled pages, and we had everything laid out and ordered, and it was very important to me to have order and focus and have things neat and have a clear understanding. I look at my kids on the computer, and they've a bit of messaging going on there. They're watching a movie here, they're playing a bit of cards there, and they're also doing their school project, and they're able to keep all of these balls in the air and interlinked. And it's a completely different way of using and looking at information, and very, very hard for someone like me to see the opportunities that they're going to see in different connections with things. And whatever, this is one of the reasons that we are so bad at predicting the future, because we're only able to imagine what we see now, and inevitably we will be seeing, anyhow, Nicholas is going to talk about all of this much better than me, so will you please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's great to be here. You're a visual culture person, to be within this close of the Book of Kells, and at Oscar Wilde's alma mater. It's really quite something. And I have to say I was surprised actually to be invited to an event like this, both as an academic, but also to see a university doing something so open, so progressive. And I thought to myself, well, maybe something's going on in Ireland. Turned out there's quite a bit. And I've been reading the Irish Times and online, and I was very struck by the debates on renewing the Republic. And for the poet Theo Dorgan, democracy itself is under threat, breaking down. Now that's not specific to Ireland. If we look at Italy or Russia, we can see G8 countries where it has already collapsed. In the regions where US military forces are promoting what they consider to be democracy, the democracy of Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, or Pakistan do not, shall we say, inspire confidence. In the United States itself, just before I left, an opinion poll came out showing that 45% of Republicans, that's the Conservative Party just mentioned, and that would be 25% of people overall, believe that, quote, President Obama was not born in the United States and is not eligible to be president. And these are the kind of people that we see all the time, that was just mentioned by Howard in his presentation, the so-called Tea Party types. They're predominantly of, shall we say, a certain age, and they're almost universally white. Now, if you take this significant group of people with the refusal to accept evolution, let alone climate change, a very significant percentage of the United States rejects rational argument as a means for decision-making. But I don't actually think, nonetheless, that the sky is falling. If you look at things from my perspective, I'm going to try and show you this afternoon, centralized authority has been trying, with considerable success, to prevent a certain kind of democracy by means of what I'm going to call visuality. And it might be saying something about time here. In the perspective of climate change, geological time is what we've been talking about. But we've actually so successfully managed to interfere with time that we've created a whole new geological period. It's called the Anthropocene. We've made that. The previous one is called the Holocene, lasts for millions of years. And within that time frame then, this very brief time frame that we're talking about has become not just human time, but geological time. So even though I'm going to take you back in some moments here and discuss in the next 10 years over about a century or so, in the space of time that we're thinking about, it's still incredibly brief. What we're seeing today are the results of a complex and divergent results of the failure of various kinds of authority, political, military, ecclesiastical, even parental. What that authority has tried to do for a long time is to assert that they can see the patterns of society and history, and we cannot. Now, in everyday life, you experience this as when the police come up to you and say, move on, there's nothing to see here. And so this is an example that's taken from the British government's attempt to make it illegal to demonstrate within a mile of Parliament. Nothing to see here, except that there is. And we know it, and so do they. What they are claiming is we have no right or reason to look at whatever it is that they deem to be subject to their authority. Now this is an old idea, and its name is what I'm calling visuality, but it's not my word. It's a word that was coined by the conservative historian Thomas Carlyle in 1840, and it was done as a response to the threat of revolution at that time and the emancipation of the enslaved, which had just happened. For Carlyle, only the hero can visualize history as it happens and its consequences. The hero must then be followed without question, an idea that was extremely congenial to later imperial and dictatorial leaders. It's one of the reasons that we hear very little of Carlyle today, because Hitler was reading one of his books in the Berlin bunker in 1945. But if we don't hear so much of Carlyle, the general idea is visible every time you walk into a bookstore and you see a big pile of biographies. Great men make history is Carlyle's central idea. And visualizing was based on the visualizing of battles by generals. It was described in the classic On War by Clausewitz, published in 1832. And the rationale here is that the battlefield at this point becomes too large for any one person to be able to physically see. So you have to visualize it. That means bringing images, information, intuition, and imagination into play. And I'm showing you here a map of the Battle of Waterloo as an example. This is then the visualization of visuality. Showing you Waterloo because Napoleon was held to be the master visualizer. He was often deceiving the opponents with less skilled in visualizing with visual tricks, attacking in a particular place where they could see him, thinking that where his main move was, and then he would come around the side. So Napoleon was the paradigm of the hero for Carlyle. If this history has been much forgotten of late, it was well known to all the moderns. Oscar Wilde owned Carlyle's writing desk, wrote his plays on it. And visuality is, as you will all remember, in Joyce, when Daedalus is on the beach, in the Telemachus section of Ulysses, he muses on the ineluctable modality of ineluctable visuality. So throughout the modern period, we've seen not just the simple spread of visual images and the rise of visual media, but the steady intensification of our relationships to the work of visualizing and its authorizing. Received patterns of authority, however, have come under increased pressure from the imagining of the global. Now, one cannot perceive the global, we can only imagine. The same has, of course, been true of the nation. We imagine ourselves to be Irish, American, or English, a work that involves bringing images and ideas and insight into a pattern that we then call a community. But it increasingly looks as if there are major difficulties in resolving that set of imaginings with others that are trying to imagine global or planetary structures of belonging and need. Now, we've recently seen the reaction to the economic crisis in the form of intensified nationalism. If there's any form of economic recovery, I'd certainly expect to see the nation come under renewed question as an imagined community, and that's likely to provoke all kinds of upheavals. We've recently seen in Hungary, just this past week, an overtly fascist party winning some 16 to 20% of the vote out there. Now, one symptom, and not, I want to stress, the cause of these conceptual debates, is the dramatic spread of images. Now, certainly, if you're one of the 1.7 billion people worldwide who have access to the internet, that's 25% of the global population now have access to the internet, something that I would probably have to explain to you what it was when I first started teaching. That's really extraordinary. And you can certainly see and visualize remarkable things. A little too fast there. This is a picture taken by VISTA, which is the Visible and Infrared Survey Telescope for Astronomy, taking new pictures of what we used to call outer space. And looking at this, space turns out not to be empty at all, but dazzlingly full and beautiful in entirely new and hitherto unimagined ways. Back down on Earth, we've had something of an image frenzy over the last 5 to 10 years. I'm giving you here some of the figures for the immense, unimaginable quantities of images that are now available at a click of a mouse. These figures don't even account for mobile phone photography and video, which people only rarely upload to the web. And when you think that there are now 5 billion, yes, billion, mobile phones on the planet, that's a lot of images out there. Now, what this data shows is that what millions, now perhaps even billions of people, ordinary people, are trying to do is precisely what Visuality has for a long time told them that they can't, which is to envisage themselves and their own situations. I'll give you a practical example of the kind of difference that this makes on a mundane level. Last weekend, when I was writing this talk, it was the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King on the 4th of April 1968. When I first went to New York as a teenager in 1980, I went to an institution that no longer exists called the Museum of Broadcasting, where you could look at old film and video. And I called up a tape that had on it Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And in watching that speech, I discovered for the first time that there had been something called the March on Washington, that a great deal of people had spoken, many people had performed, other than King. It was a remarkable experience. But now, if I wanted to do that, if one of you wanted to do that, you could do it in seconds from any part of the globe. So the archive is different. Whereas once access to archives was carefully regulated, as it still is just over the way, it is now democratized, it's distributed, it's different. Archives were a key part of authority, and their transformation is going to have long-term effects. The first thing that we know is that museums, archives, and universities no longer control access to the image. We know that these institutions are going to have to change. We don't yet know what the effects of that change will be. And my colleague Clay Shirky puts it, this is the moment like Gutenberg. We know that the printing exists, but we don't know what it's going to do yet. One way you can track the present centrality of the visual, the part that makes visuality possible, is in the idea that's the title of our symposium today, 2020 Vision. It's actually a relatively recent idea. The 19th century created a standardizing of vision and visual practice. It was in about 1790 that the British scientist John Dalton noticed that he couldn't tell the difference between what other people called red and green. And he called this condition Daltonism, as a curiosity. About 50 years later, following a series of train crashes, it became clear that these crashes had been caused by the inability of the signalmen to distinguish red from green, which suddenly became something of a problem. So you had to devise color blindness tests. Don't worry if you can't see anything here, because if you blow them up, they actually get very difficult to see. So then we've got an identification of a problem, is given a name, you devise a standardized test, and in turn you create mechanical means for creating standardized colors. In other words, it's important that you're looking at the same red and the same green. That's the origin of our present range of Pantone colors. It made journeys safer, of course, but as many as 1 in 4 railwaymen were fired at the time. It seems to be far higher than modern levels of color blindness. And beginning in 1843, doctors called for a test for vision as a whole, leading in 1863 to the now familiar Snellen test of letters, which was put in practice later in the century. And if you look about halfway down here, there's 2020. And this band between the red and the green line is for those of us wearing corrective lenses of one sort or another, which is, I suspect, most of us. That's how we all now see. Many people, though, even have sharper vision. Tiger Woods is alleged to have had laser surgery to render his vision 2015. Didn't help him see that fire hydrant, though, did it? In short, standardized vision combined with military visualization of the concept of visuality as an expression of authority has given great intensity to this very complex phenomenon we casually call the visual image. And it's been really cinema that has become the great modern medium for the definition and demonstration of standardized vision and later sound, and the shaping of the cultural imagination. So let me take a key point from the Oscars in 2010, that it offered us a range of choices for the future. Now, Star Trek hoped for a transformation here on Earth as part of the United Federation of Planets. Avatar, on the top there, could only imagine such a transformation out there somewhere, on Pandora, a planet that humans would only have access to as computer-generated avatars. But what won big was neither of these imaginings of the future, but The Hurt Locker, the movie on the left, the war movie that ends with the bomb disposal expert striding off, not into the sunset, but to disable yet another device. In the imagining of The Hurt Locker, the future is permanent war. And the name for this idea is CounterInsurgency. Counterinsurgency was defined as US military doctrine by a field manual published in 2006, FM 324. You can download it from the internet, and about 3 million people have. It argues that war is about more than simply fighting battles. It's about controlling cultures. Counterinsurgency is now a global strategy which imagines the entire planet as a potential space of insurgency. That is to say, there isn't an insurgency now, there might be one soon, so you better prepare for it. And it has created a model: clear, hold, and build. And what this means is you have to first clear the insurgents from an area. You then have to hold that with the presence of physical troops on the ground, and very often by building physical structures, as they've done very extensively in Baghdad, building walls and so on. And then in that space, you build what we might call government services. Now, this model is being used not just for fighting wars, but for all kinds of social practice, ranging from undocumented immigration on the US-Mexico border to controlling New York City high schools, where high school kids are regarded as the insurgents, and to dealing with natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, which was perceived as a case of an insurgency. So what counterinsurgency does is it generates what it calls legitimacy. Same thing as what I've been calling authority. And it does this by a range of activities, of which, as you can see here, combat operations are only one part. That being up here is one part, but then there's all of these other components here. Working together with market building, shaping governance, and generally what used to be called, in a derogatory term, nation building. Counterinsurgency then seeks to build a range of new nations in the image of the West. And I would say this is not the West as it is, but a sort of imagined West, the West as it should be. The practical means for this are kind of a curious hybrid. They explicitly reference T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, the First World War hero of counter-espionage. But they do this in a framework drawn from the internet and from what is called net war. Now, Lawrence, you remember, was himself involved in an insurgency against the Ottoman Empire. And the very success of that insurgency was in part responsible for the British mandate in Palestine and in Iraq that has largely created the conditions, ironically, that require today's counterinsurgency in those regions. But no matter. In the counterinsurgency manual, Lawrence's mantra is held to be a paradigm of proper counterinsurgency tactics. This is what he said: better an Arab do it tolerably than you do it perfectly. To put in bold face in the counterinsurgency manual. So these are what they call small wars, imperial small wars, as opposed to major wars against national armies. I'm showing you photographs on the bottom here that were taken by the Vietnamese-American photographer Anne My Le, and he depicts recreations that are taking place in California of the Vietnam War as a kind of hobby. But these imperial wars are wars for the digital age. Past and present tactics converge in the central practice described as the commander's visualization of his area of operation. So they're directly using Carlyle's term. Now this visualizing involves the whole history and culture of the area, down to the last grievance, as well as the topography and geography. It's assisted by the presence in every combat brigade in Iraq and Afghanistan of an anthropologist. It's usually the one person around who actually speaks the language. If you combine this with digital information, it produces a postmodern visualization. And the army spends an immense amount of time making PowerPoints, rather like the one I'm showing you, in order to share this information. The contradiction at present of the counterinsurgency ideology that I've just described and its actual practice are these machines. They're called unmanned aerial vehicles. This one is called the Predator. And they can take high-resolution digital images, if you see the camera here, and they can fire weapons. These are the dominant counterinsurgency technology in Afghanistan and Pakistan at the moment. They're being used very intensively. And the UAV returns to a tradition of counterinsurgency that was begun in the French War in Algeria in 1954, which is to say you kill the leaders of the insurgency. It's very different to clear, hold, and build. Now, as you all know, the war in Algeria failed from the French point of view. But this form of visualizing isn't really intended to win. It's intended to hold the status quo as it is, at a relatively low cost. And ironically, the army likes to justify using these because they're low environmental impact. And this is what is produced. It's an invisible war, what I call post-perspectival. If you remember your art history classes, a perspective image, such as a photograph, not only represents an image in 3 dimensions, so you can tell depth and so on, but it also gives you information about where the photographer was placed when he or she took the image. But the unmanned aerial vehicle is operated remotely from trailers like this one. They're situated in Utah, and they're controlled by Air Force specialists who use joysticks, which are exactly the same as those used for video games, to control the machines. And in fact, this is regarded as quite dull work, and they can control up to about 20 of these creatures or craft at once. So if you're on the ground, or if you're even looking at the images that the Predator generates, you can't deduce where the attacker is or what they may do. The Air Force doesn't even bother encrypting the signal that the Predators send because they know the information won't help a hacker. In addition, the military are using invisible modes of detection, such as infrared and satellite photography. And all this invisible targeting contrasts with a series of new tactics that have been adopted by on-the-ground counterinsurgency, such as those being used by General McChrystal in Marja, Afghanistan, where he announced his attack before it happened. And the goal was to reduce civilian casualties, which indeed it did. But it also reduced Taliban casualties. So it's now entirely unclear who actually controls that city. All of this suggests that counterinsurgency is now a kind of theatre, with competing stunts being performed for those who consider themselves always already entitled to see. That is to say, it's a very intense debate going on within the US military about what form of counterinsurgency is the future of military tactics. Now, it seems extremely likely that either way, in 2020, the world will still be subject to counterinsurgency strategy, as indeed it has since 1947, when Harry Truman announced the Cold War as a justification against terror. For reasons of budget, though, it's much more likely, I think, to be the remote targeted surveillance and missile counterinsurgency than the boots on the ground nation building that we've seen since 2003. But remember, counterinsurgency doesn't imagine victory. It just wants to get to the next level of this ultimate, massively multiplayer video game imaginary, to keep playing. Now, what alternatives to counterinsurgency's vision of the global can we imagine? Now, it would seem that the best place to start would be where Howard did, with the threat to the biosphere from climate change that might lead to the extermination of all life forms. And the most effective icon of climate change, beyond the data that's been presented so effectively this afternoon, has been this. Oh, how about the polar bear on ice has become really the poster child for climate change. There are some websites where if you give money to a climate change cause, the ice will grow around the digital bear. So the idea here is that we save ourselves by saving the bears. If the bears become extinct, then so do we. Where does this idea come from? It comes very specifically from, I think, from this particular magazine cover, published by Time magazine in 2006, which creates an anthropomorphic identification with the bear. That is to say, we're afraid that the ice is going to melt and we will drown. And we've learned to identify with animals of this kind via teddy bears and Disney movies and animations of all kinds. But real polar bears can swim up to 100 kilometers. They move from ice floe to ice floe as their normal hunting pattern. So polar bears are certainly under threat. But this photograph tells us absolutely nothing about that threat. The risk for them is that ultimately there will not be enough ice floes to hunt from, but we can't deduce that from this photograph. What we've learned to do, though, is to identify with them. This is the other side of this story. It's a photograph you won't have seen unless you're a real climate change freak, I think. This is a photograph taken by a blogger of some of the first climate-displaced peoples from the Carteret Islands, which is an archipelago part of the island chain of Papua New Guinea. Now, these are real people having to leave their homes because of climate change. Now, not in 2080 or something, now. This is an island, another island part of that chain, used to be called Huni. It's now, as you can see, split into two. The main reason that people have had to leave the islands is because of this flooding. Not yet in absolute drowning of the islands, but the flooding makes it impossible to cultivate food and indeed, of course, just to pursue everyday life. Now, this is part of the story that we have shied away from. They're estimated to be 150 million to 1 billion people who may be forced to migrate. For the island chain of Tuvalu, which has a population of 14,000, some 4,000 have already relocated to New Zealand, and most of the rest are expected to leave by 2020. So it's really important to say that climate change is now, not the future. However, the we that imagines itself to be part of the West do not identify with these images. Rather, we turn them into the other. What that is to say is we look at this and we say, that's not me. It's someone else, an other. Now, in that process of othering, the word migrant serves as what in US political discourse is called a pivot word. That's to say, a word that changes the resonance of an argument. So whereas you might think climate change is bad, migration is often felt to be even worse. And this other is not just different then, they become a potential threat. In Australia, for example, which is a continent-sized island with only 18 million people, the government has declared that it is, quote, full. So there's no room for any of these people. And indeed, the Western military has now created the idea of climate security as a key part of counterinsurgency strategy. That is to say that it's likely that climate migration will cause further counterinsurgency, justifying not action against climate change, as you might think, but more counterinsurgency funding. So all of this adds up, in my mind, to reminding me of one moment in recent United States history, the flooding of New Orleans by Hurricane Katrina. Seeing what happened there, we should not be surprised that what's happening in the South Pacific is happening today. One of the largest cities in the United States was allowed to flood, its people were not rescued, and the city has largely not been rebuilt. Now, I imagine, therefore, that relatively little will be done to mitigate climate change. By 2020, we're going to be still further adapting to it, which has the very unfortunate side effect that the dreadful film Waterworld, starring Kevin Costner, is retrospectively going to seem clairvoyant. If it's too late, as it seems to be, to change the carbon dioxide disaster by 2020, how about the idea that all humans be considered equally worthy of being alive? If all the world, as both counterinsurgency and global markets has it, is now a democracy, do all the people in it have a vote? If not, how is this latter-day poll tax to be justified? And finally, I want to suggest that the future crisis in visuality is already here. We heard a great deal about what's happening in China at the moment, but I'm showing you here what happens if you try to access Google China. You get routed to Hong Kong. And that is, of course, as you know, I'm sure, to avoid censorship. That's done by Google, not by the Chinese government. Search defines the present internet. Very hard, I think, for most people to know how to use the web without using search. And so in China, search is being subject to content censorship, as it has been in Singapore, Myanmar, Burma, Iran, and elsewhere. In the United States, a recent court decision suggests that there's actually going to be a censorship of the market. And this will take place by the ending of what is known as net neutrality. This means at present, your internet provider has to offer equally rapid access to all websites, whatever you choose to go and look at. If you end web neutrality, the providers will be allowed to let favored websites load faster than others. Now, the current excuse is piracy, particularly the site BitTorrent. But it's really easy to see how this idea might be extended politically and in other ways. However, my sense here is much more positive. Networked information is very hard to contain. And I don't think these efforts will be successful. I don't think they'll even be partially successful. But what's at stake is what ultimately we imagine the internet to be about. What's it for? Corporations want us to use it passively, to receive content. So the most obvious recent icon of that kind of vision of the internet is the iPad. You can't do anything with an iPad except look at stuff that other people have made. It's nice for that, but that's all that it is. Open source activists and geeks of all kinds want us to use the internet to make things. And I would argue that that would include democracy, in which, again, a local form of participation could again become a practical possibility. And I don't mean by this simply voting. Voting, as we know, changes very little. That's why they allow it. But if there were to be some form of far wider participation, it could clearly be enabled by digital technologies. Having said that, the ordinary redundancy of the voting system in the United States, and indeed the UK, is known to us all, and I think it's very likely that changes will be made in that by 2020. So, in one line to conclude, the crisis, in short, is a choice between authorizing authority and democratizing democracy. Do we continue to move on, or do we say no? There is something to see. At this point, I turn it over to you.